Hi guys, welcome to my office. I'm sure a lot of you will have seen the video that I produced last year on the slow death of longwave. It was one of the most popular videos in the history of Oxford Shortwave log. It led to me being contacted by the BBC to be interviewed for an article that eventually appeared on their website in the technology of or the business of technology or the technology of business, I can't remember which way around it was, part of their website. And I wasn't that happy with the article, if I'm honest. The kind of angle that the sort of researcher took didn't really completely align with what I'd spoken to him about, but it was largely accurate. But it kind of demonstrated how that video and what's happening with longwave and AM broadcasting in general sort of resonated with a lot of people. And it made me think actually that I've got just about enough information to do a kind of a numerical analysis on the history of longwave over the first 100 years. And largely by using my previous editions of the World Radio and TV Handbook. So 1976 edition there, 1986, 1981, which appeared on a video recently, as you guys know, and 1998, etc. So today it's 2025. Longwave broadcasting started in about 1925 with the BBC, etc. If you look online, and I've used sort of a couple of AI resources. There are about a dozen stations on longwave by the sort of end of 1925. Obviously, the BBC were there. France were on longwave, Germany, Sweden, a few other stations. So about a dozen, approximately, in 100 years ago. The next kind of data point comes from this book, Nunes Everyman's Wireless Book by F.J. Cam, quite a well-known author. This was published in 1934, and this book means everything to me because it was owned by my granddad, who was into it. He wasn't a radio amateur, but he was into radio, and in the Second World War, he used to repair Shackletons, but he knew a lot about radio, how they worked, and would. I remember him spending time in the garage, sort of fixing stuff. He was quite good electrically. So published in 1934, and in the back of this book, this book is basically about how radios work, how to repair them, sort of issues with, faults, various fault modes, reception issues, antennas, etc. At the back of this book is a table, wavelengths under the Lucerne Plan from the World Radio list. Now, this plan so this list is in accordance with the Lucerne Plan, January the 5th, 1934. So this is the state of play for AM broadcasting. Now, I'm just assuming Europe, North Africa, Middle East, but it's basically a list of the radio stations in this region in a layout or arranged in a way that, like, presumably all nations agreed to. So these are the wavelengths, frequencies for all the there's only AM stations in those days anyway. And so this was So this is a snapshot of long wave and medium wave in January 1934. If you actually go down the list, so you've got, so for example, Ankara, Turkey on 183 kilohertz to start with. There's a few in here. It says Bazov, but I'm assuming that's a typo. Brazov, Romania, 160 kilocycles, 160 kilohertz. And of course, Brazov, Romania, antenna satellite are still there or thereabouts on 153 kilohertz. So there you go. This was 90 years ago. 160 kilohertz, and then just keep going down the list. Daventry, 200 kilohertz, so we're still there. Deutschland Sender. So that's sender is signal in German. 200 kilohertz, 191 kilohertz. Anyway, so you get the idea. So this is how all the longwave stations for this region were sort of allocated. The frequencies were allocated as per the Lucerne Plan. And when you go through this list, there were actually 25 stations broadcasting on what we know as the longwave bands, and in the space today, what we would consider the gap between long wave and medium wave. I mean, these days, the end of long wave is recognised to be sort of 270 kilohertz, something like that. And then obviously medium wave starts at kind of 530. So, for example, there's Oulu, Finland, 431 kilohertz. So I've included that. There used to be a lot of Russian stations in that sort of no man's land between what we recognise as long wave and medium wave. So here we go, 355 kilocycles, Rostov-on-Don, Russia. So, bottom line, if AI is correct, there were about a dozen stations on long wave in 1925. In 1934, so 9 years later, there were 25, okay? So that was actually really interesting. I've looked at that plan before, but it's now got some context to it. And as I said, my granddad won a prize at school. He went to Magdalen College School in Oxford, and I can't remember exactly what he did, but he did some good work at school, and this book was his prize. And so he's been gone a long time now. He died in decades ago. And so this book has a lot of sentimental value to me. But there you go. So so 25 stations in 1935. Fast forward to 1963, and to the long medium wave stations of Europe, North America, and the Near East. Interesting here. So 151 kilocycles, Moscow 1. And Hamburg, 155 kilohertz, Tromsø, and Brasov. So, and now Brasov are currently, as I just said, on 153 kilohertz. So, Romania have been on that frequency thereabouts for literally decades. But anyway, if you go down the list, and also including those stations that appear above 270 kilohertz and below 530. In 1963, there were 35 stations listed on long wave, 35. So about a dozen in 1925, 25 in 1934, and then 35 in 1963. So over 3 decades, not much movement. An additional 10 stations in 3 decades. But I guess the thing with long wave is that the band is actually very narrow. You've used 270 to 153 kilohertz. It's like it's a bit over 100 kilohertz wide. So it's whereas medium wave is 1 megahertz wide or wider. 1.2 megahertz wide. So even if you include the band between what we consider to be the top of long wave and the start of medium wave, it's a narrow band. To have 35 stations on a band that narrow, back in the day when you tuned through long wave, it was going to, it would have appeared, that band would have been booming compared to how it is today. But there you go, 1963, 35 stations. Fast forward to 1976. And the situation's much better. If you actually go through long and medium wave, if you go through the long and medium wave station section in 1976, Europe, Africa, and Near Middle East, there are 54 stations on long wave. So from 63 to 76, so in 13 years, almost 20 new stations have appeared. Now, one presumes that might be down to the Cold War, although longwave was never really been a band for international broadcasting. So it's difficult to explain why there would be such a large increase, relatively speaking, in the number of longwave stations between 1963 and 1976, but nevertheless, they're the numbers here in 1976. And then if you then fast forward to 1981, There was a slight decrease. There were 48 stations on longwave in 1981. 48. So 6 stations disappeared, or maybe more, and new stations have appeared. But the difference is 6 stations. So just above 50 stations, 76, just below in 1981. And then weirdly, if you then fast forward to 1986, there were 51 stations on longwave. So back up from 48 to 51. I wonder if that's just, not it wouldn't be an error in terms of the information, but it makes you wonder, doesn't it, whether something got missed in 1981. But anyway, 51. So from 76 to 1981, to 1986. So over a period of 10 years, the number of stations on longwave was very sort of constant at 54 to 56. So around about 55 stations over that sort of 10-year period. I guess you would consider that a healthy number of stations on a narrow band. In 2002, there were still 50 stations, and I looked up because I have the 2002 edition of the World Radio Handbook. So in 2002, there were still 50 stations. So again, from 1976 to 2002, so effectively a quarter of a century, the number of stations on longwave remained very consistent. Bearing in mind that 2002, 12, 13 years after the Berlin Wall came down, effectively the Cold War had ended, and it hadn't really affected the population of stations on the longwave band. However, by 2010, there were only 22. So in 8 years, the number of stations on longwave dropped from 50 to 22, and that 22 includes 3 stations for Radio 4, so the transmitters at Droitwich, Berghead and Westerglen. So in reality, in terms of different stations, it's only 20. So it's dropped basically 30 stations in 8 years in 2010. And then in 2021, and I've been through this before, as you know, there were only 13. And in 2025, there are 10. But that also includes the 3 separate transmissions for Radio 4. So very slow increase in stations from 1935 to the 1970s. Basically, the number of stations doubled between 1935 and 1970, so over sort of several decades. And then from the 1970s all the way through to the very early 2000s, the number of stations on longwave remained pretty consistent. And then between 2002 and 2010, they dropped. The number of stations reduced dramatically. According to AI, in 2005, there were 38 stations. So I don't have that data myself because I don't have the book for 2005. So I do have the data for 2002 from the WRTH, so 50, and I have the data for 2010, 22. According to online sources, there were 38 in 2005. So it's kind of a slow decline from 2002 through to 2010. And kind of why, I started thinking about, why is that? Well, it's got nothing to do with FM VHF. The BBC launched the sort of home service light program, third program on FM in 1958. So that certainly had nothing to do with it. They did, however, start streaming on the internet in 1997. So in 1997, the BBC started streaming. The main major radio stations started. The National DAB multiplex came in 1999. So if you look at the numbers, in 2002 there were 50 stations on longwave. By 2010 there were 22. So streaming and DAB, and I guess obviously the increase in over time, energy just gets more and more expensive. we know that AM broadcasting is expensive, and obviously high power long wave transmitters are very expensive to run. The death, that was effectively the death knell for the long wave band. But it's interesting for me because I love long wave and it's dying a slow death. But the bottom line is that it took quite a long time for the number of stations on the band to increase up to around 50. It took sort of more than 3 decades, and then for a quarter of a century, the number of stations on long wave was around 50 stations, and it appears that it was really the introduction of the internet, online streaming, only took a few years for AM broadcasting to sort of start to go into decline, including long wave. And then obviously with the DAB national multiplex coming in '99, that was sort of basically the beginning of the end. So there you go. So it's interesting because I used to think, well, when I was a kid, there used to be hundreds of stations on long wave, and that was never the case. It just felt like it was because, there were 50 stations, give or take, but the band obviously is very narrow compared, it's only about a tenth of the band width of medium wave. So it obviously, and at night, those stations will, most of the stations on long wave will come in strongly without any kind of, or with almost no QS Baker, without, any fading. They used to be rock solid because long wave propagation is dominated by the ground wave. And yeah, I always remember the long wave band being very, very crowded, but it just goes to show that in a narrow band, 50 stations can sound like the band is literally absolutely chock-a-block with signals. And here we are now today with 6 or 7 stations left, which is such a shame. But there you go. These you can buy old editions of the WRTH on sort of eBay. I think you can even buy them on sort of Amazon when they're available, and they are quite interesting if you love radio and you're interested in the history of radio. And I'm becoming more interested in the history of radio, that's for sure. These books are so interesting. The other thing that's really interesting is obviously looking at the advertisements, etc., of hardware, radio receivers, etc., as you know. But you can use them to track the state of broadcasting on any band, so you can look at long wave, what was it like in the 1970s? Well, okay, so it was like this. What was the shape of long wave in the 80s? And you only need a couple of editions from that decade to get a sort of reasonable handle on, what was happening. So there you go. It's a shame, excuse me, what's happening to long wave, but I get some solace from being able to sort of track its progress over the last 100 years. What a story. Anyway, I think it's about time I had another cup of tea, so before I have a coughing fit. But anyway, thank you very much for watching, and 7-3.